all my colleagues who've considered this and given us every opportunity to make our case. I want to again thank Senators Manchin and Schumer and Senator Kirk for the very hard work they've done on this, and I urge them to support the Manchin-Toomey amendment. With that, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote in relation to an amendment number 715 offered by the Senator from West Virginia, Mr. Manchin. The Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, thank you. Let me just say, if you are committed to protecting the Second Amendment rights that you and I have as law-abiding citizens in this great country, you should vote for this bill. If you desire for all our veterans to be treated with dignity and due process when they return from battle, you should vote for this bill. If you want to keep criminals and dangerously mentally ill people from purchasing guns at gun shows and on the Internet, you should vote for this bill. And, Mr. President, if you want to remember those 20 babies, beautiful children, and the 6 brave teachers, and you want to honor the most courageous family members I have ever met in my life, please consider you should vote for this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, thank you. By the way, we're the states that's got the first in the nation caucuses.
That's why I corrected myself, sir.
I strongly oppose this amendment. Expanded background checks would not have prevented Newtown. Criminals do not submit to background checks now. They will not submit to expanded background checks. The Deputy Director of the National Institute of Justice has written that background checks will work only if they are universal and are combined with gun registration. This amendment would start us down that road of registration. It would open, not close loopholes. It would require background checks when people advertise a gun for sale in their church bulletins or Farm Bureau newsletter. It subjects people to federal criminal liability, up to 5 years of violation of state or local law, which of course is unprecedented. And the pro-gun provisions would actually reduce existing protections for law-abiding gun owners. I urge my colleagues to reject this dangerous and misguided approach. I yield the floor and back my time.
The question is on the amendment. Is there sufficient second? The Senator, is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi,
I think it's number 7.
Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johan, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar,
You're back.
Looks like the Irish flag, man.
A little bit, yeah. And then green, orange.
Green and orange, I like it.
Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor,
Thank you.
Mr. Reed of Rhode Island,
Thanks for confirming that.
Mr. Reed of Nevada,
No, you were there once a month.
Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey,
Because that's what I never knew who it really was. We had so much fun. You had Cheryl C. to Maverick family. Yeah. Cheryl C. And that was just
Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Brown, Coons, Heinrich, Hirono, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Nelson, Reed of Nevada, Schatz, Toomey, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cornyn, Cruz, Grassley, Heller, Isaacson, Johan, Paul, Pryor, Risch, and Vitter. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Hoban, no. Yes, sir. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Cowan, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye.
You liked it. Which is
Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Beckich, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Ms. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte, no. Obvious. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Flake? Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. McConnell? No. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Rubio? No. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Lautenberg? Aye. Mr. Lautenberg? Aye.
Be ordered in the Senate.
Mr. Levin? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
ready when you are, Sean.
I'm not ready for the order in the Senate. The vote on this vote, the yeas are 54, the nays are 46. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. The Senator, the Majority Leader.
I enter a motion to reconsider the vote by which Manchin Amendment number 715 was not agreed to.
The motion is entered. There are now 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to the amendment number 725 offered by the Senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley. Who yields time?
Mr. President.
There will be order in the Senate. The gallery will refrain from any demonstration or comment. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I rise to speak in favor of the Grassley-Cruz substitute. Now that the previous vote has been taken, I would suggest that this is a bill that we all should be able to support. This is a bill that provides major resources to prosecuting violent criminals, to going after felons, to going after fugitives, to preventing them from getting guns. It provides resources for school safety. It provides additional resources to improve the background check system and to encourage states to provide more records on mental health illness. This is a strong law enforcement bill, and I know everyone in this body, regardless of party, wants to act decisively to stop violent crime, and it would be a shame if this amendment is subject to a partisan vote, which would result in inaction rather than us standing together to put law enforcement resources towards stopping violent crime.
Senator's time's expired.
President, can we have order?
Senate will be in order. The Senator deserves to be heard. This President pro tempore is recognized.
Mr. President, the argument that we just heard is absolutely upside down on what that amendment is. This amendment guts the bill, it guts straw purchasing, gun trafficking. It totally undermines law enforcement. Law enforcement strongly supports the next amendment we have, the Leahy-Collins. But all this does, this amendment could aid Mexican drug cartels. It eliminates the tools being used to get law enforcement investigative leads. It undermines rather than strengthens the current background check. You know, we talk about, do we enforce our laws? If you want to gut our laws, which this one does, don't argue that it's not being enforced. This handcuffs law enforcement, helps drug cartels, helps crime syndicates. It's a bad amendment.
Senator's time has expired. The question's on the amendment. Is there a second? There's sufficient second. There appears. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
One vote yes.
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett.
Menendez.
Sure. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer.
Donovan. Levin.
No.
Cardin.
Pardon, no.
Thank you. Thank you, President.
I got
Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Burr? Ms. Cantwell? Mr. Cardin? Mr. Carper? Mr. Casey? Mr. Chambliss? Okay. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coburn? Mr. Cochran? Ms. Collins? Mr. Coons? Mr. Corker? Sanders? Fisher? I got you. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cowan? Mr. Crapo? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Durbin? Mr. Enzi? Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Flake? Mr. Franken? Mrs. Gillibrand? Mr. Graham? Mr. Grassley? Mrs. Hagan? Mr. Harkin? Mr. Hatch? Mr. Heinrich? Ms. Heitkamp? Mr. Heller? Ms. Hirono? Mr. Hoven? Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Isaacson? Mr. Johans? Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Kane? Mr. King? Mr. Kirk? Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Landrieu? Mr. Lautenberg? Mr. Leahy? Mr. Lee? I do. Yes, sir. Mr. Levin? Mr. Manchin? Mr. McCain? Mrs. McCaskill? Mr. McConnell? Mr. Menendez? Mr. Merkley? Ms. Mikulski? Mr. Moran? Ms. Murkowski? Mr. Murphy? Mrs. Murray? Mr. Nelson? Mr. Paul? Mr. Portman? Mr. Pryor? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Mr. Reed of Nevada? Mr. Risch? Mr. Roberts? Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rubio? Mr. Sanders? Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
Yeah.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Begich, Blunt, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heitkamp, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Cowan, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye.
Don't be hearing the door from me anymore.
Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mrs. Feinstein? No.
Any senators wishing to vote? In this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of the amendment, this amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, there are now 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 713, offered by the senator from Vermont, Mr. Leahy. The Senate will be in order. Senators on both sides deserve to be heard. Please take conversations off the floor. Senior Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, Senator Collins and I, as well as other senators in both parties, worked with law enforcement, worked with the NRA, worked with a whole lot of others to craft this. It gives law enforcement officials the tools they need to stop the all-too-common practices of straw purchasing and illegal trafficking of firearms. This gives us the tools to go after drug cartels that use straw purchasers to get their guns, gangs in big cities use straw purchasers to get their guns. It's an important law enforcement measure. Across the political spectrum, law enforcement supports it. Let's stand with law enforcement and vote aye.
The Senate will be in order. Please take conversations off the floor. Senator from Vermont.
And I move to reconsider the last vote. Lay it on the table.
Without objection. So ordered. Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
I rise to speak against this amendment. It is worthwhile to strengthen the protections against straw purchasing and trafficking, but unfortunately this language, in my judgment, is overbroad and in particular has a real risk of criminalizing innocent conduct. For example, if your father asks you to purchase a firearm for him and your father pays you, under this bill, both you and your father become felons, because it bans any purchase for another person if that individual pays for it. In my judgment, that is overbroad, and that is the reason why in the prior amendment we changed the language to target bad actors and to exclude innocent conduct, to avoid ensnaring those law-abiding citizens with no ill will and to inadvertently make law-abiding gun owners into felons. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? Is there a sufficient second? Okay, there appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. K9. No. Better. Sanders. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Pickett. Heinrich. Sheehan. Blake Town. Reed. Baldwin and Reed. I know. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Kuhn. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Hagan, aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand. Right there. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
I'm here. I'm on top of
Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Cowan, Donnelly, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoban, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Paul, no.